Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished guests. I'm Hashem Dezbash, Chair of the Economics Department, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the second Kofogoulos Economics Nobel Laureate Lecture Series. This event is made possible by a generous gift from our late colleague, Professor Milton Kofogoulos, in memory of his wife, Virginia Kofogoulos. Professor Kofogoulos was a distinguished economist who contributed significantly to the field of welfare economics and economics of regulation. He joined Emory University as a George Woodruff Professor of Economics in 1979 after years in Washington, D.C., where he had served on the President Carter's Executive Council for Economics and President Ford's Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations and the Council on Wage and Price Stability. Professor Kofogoulos retired in 1998 but continued to teach on a voluntary basis in our department for many years. He passed away in fall of 2014. Although he did not see the inauguration of the Nobel Laureate Lecture Series he funded, his wish for having speakers whose work has been far-reaching and impactful certainly came true. It is my pleasure now to ask the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Michael Elliott, to introduce our distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Hashem, and thank you everyone for being here today. It's a real honor and, to be honest, a very daunting task to introduce our wonderful speaker, Dr. Thomas Sargent. Daunting because if I were to recount all of his honors and awards, that would be the whole lecture. Dr. Sargent is, among other things, of course, a Nobel laureate, the W.R. Berkeley Professor of Economics and Business at NYU, and the architect of rational expectation revolution in economics. He received his bachelor's degree in economics from Berkeley, and then later his doctorate degree from Harvard at the ripe age of 25. He's held faculty positions at the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Minnesota, University of Chicago, Stanford, Princeton, and now, of course, as I mentioned, NYU. He's a prolific and influential economist who's authored 15 books and published more than 190 papers in prestigious academic journals, 36 of them in the vaunted top 5 of economics, about which we all hear so much. Besides numerous scholarly articles and books, his textbooks, Macroeconomic Theory, Dynamic Macroeconomic Theory, and Recursive Macroeconomic Theory, have become classical in macroeconomics. And he is now among the top 20 most cited economists in the world. In 2011, with Christopher Sims of Princeton University, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for their empirical research on the cause and effect in the macroeconomy. His work focuses on longer-run structural changes in the economy, and he analyzes historical data to better understand how these types of policy changes affect the economy over time. If you wish, after you receive this lecture today, you can return to your laptop and stream the Nobel laureate lecture that he delivered after receiving the award. It's a wonderful performance in every way. One of the things I think is brilliant is he comes on stage in Europe and describes himself as an American provincial, which I don't think is anything true, and then does a spectacular reading of the history of fiscal and monetary policy in the early republic in order to invite his audience to think about what it means for the future of the EU and Europe. It's a marvelous performance, and it also exemplifies what I think is a real hallmark of Dr. Sargent's work, his interest in bringing experience and theory together and using the work of economics to improve people's lives. Today, he is going to take on the daunting task of answering the question, what does the 2017 President Trump tax cut imply for the U.S. economic growth, inflation, and government debt? After the lecture, there'll be time to ask questions. We'll be collecting them on cards throughout the audience. But for now, please sit back and enjoy and welcome with me Dr. Sargent.
Okay. So
I'm not going to fulfill the expectations that were just created. And I'm not going to answer the questions that I was asked to answer. What I'm going to do is going to tell you how I think about them, and about you know, what I know and what I don't know, and part of what so here's the deal. Economists, political scientists, there's a lot of things we don't know, but just because we don't know everything doesn't mean we don't know something. So I'm going to try to characterize the things we know and the things we're uncertain about. Okay? And okay. And also, one of my goals is to kind of scope out what legitimate areas of disagreement and agreement are. And that's what statistics tries to teach you. You should take statistics because it teaches you how confident you can be in the statements that come out of your data and your theory. Okay. So I'm going to tell you, my big answer is, what is the 2017 President Trump tax cut? And I don't think it means the big tax cut he's getting, you may not be getting, but about the tax cut for that's in the whole bill. And there is a tax cut in the bill. Imply for the U.S. economic growth, inflation, and government debt. And I'm going to tell you why. My answer is just going to be I'm going to tell you why I don't know. And if somebody says they know, you're going to have to press them on the things they know about that I'm saying I don't know. Okay, so I'm going to go back to basics, and a completely non-ideological thing that all economists agree on. So these are things that Milton Friedman. So economists ranging from the greatest conservatives, which I'd say are Milton Friedman. I'm going to put John Maynard Keynes in there at the same time. I'll give you a quote from Keynes. He thought it, and Vladimir Lenin thought it too. So it goes through the whole scale. And that is, what the government spends, public's going to have to pay for, one way or another. That's a quote from Keynes. And what Keynes said is, well, you can pay for it either now in taxes, what the government spends now. You can pay for it either now in taxes, or you can pay for it later. And how do you pay for it later? Well, somebody's going to pay for it later. And this is something my generation has done to you. We're spending stuff. You're spending stuff now. You're transferring money to me. You're going to pay for it later. So thank you. Via Social Security. But you're going to pay later. So how are you going to pay later? You issue an IOU, and it's a government bond. Another name for a government bond, the state of Wisconsin or the city of Golden Valley in Minnesota, they would call this government bond a tax anticipation certificate. Meaning, how are we going to pay for the interest and the principal on this bond? We're going to tax you later. Now and later. We're going to raise the property tax enough to service the bond. And what's going to be enough? Well, there's a bunch of people from Moody's and the creditors who are going to make sure you raise that tax enough. That's how bond markets work. Okay, so, and another way you can tax various creditors of government. You could say only rich people are creditors of the government. You'll only say that if you're not from Argentina or Brazil or Zimbabwe, because there's a way you can tax very poor people who have to use cash. And what you do is how can you tax cash? You generate an inflation. You can collect a lot of revenue with inflation. And great scholar here is Tao Jia is working on that. Okay, the mathematics and the empirics of that. So so that's the deal. Keynes said, what the government spends now, public's going to have to pay for either now or later via taxes. Okay, that's the basics. And I could give you some really nice quotes where Lenin says that, and he manipulates it. And why do all economists agree on that? Because it's arithmetic. Everybody has a budget constraint. It's just the arithmetic of budget constraints. Okay, I'll come back to this. Okay, so now the fun thing, or the intriguing thing, is the government budget doesn't have to balance, just like your family budget or your personal budget doesn't have to balance month by month or year by year. It has to balance in what we call a present value sense. And what you mean, that's just Keynes's your dictum. If you spend more than you earn today, you're going to have to earn more than you spend tomorrow. Why? You're going to have to pay off your creditors. Oh, I see someone from Argentina. Okay, and I don't mean to nodding your head. Okay, and you say, well, wait a minute. We borrowed. Government spent money. We borrowed, and we didn't pay. And we didn't tax. And then my answer to that is, oh yeah? You didn't tax? You taxed anybody who who lent to the government. And you taxed your domestic residents. And you taxed them in insidious ways. Not directly or explicitly or courageously. You defaulted on their bank accounts. You nationalized their Social Security that you said you were going to pay. You reduced their Social Security. You defaulted on a whole bunch of promises. You broke a bunch of promises. And that's how you balance your budget. So again, Keynes and Lenin were right. Okay, so we'll go. Okay, so how should you, so this is inexorable arithmetic. It affects every country, affects every household, affects every university, affects every undergraduate who's borrowing to go to school, gambling on their human capital. Okay, so that's the deal. This is arithmetic. Okay, so now we'll ask, and this relates to what the founders of our republic, they thought hard about this. This isn't new arithmetic. Okay. So now the question is, well, what's a good way to run a government? How should the government run its finances? And you should think about that because you're voters. So I'm going to tell you a classic way that was agreed on. Now, amazingly, this was agreed on by people, many people think are conservative. Milton Friedman is the gold standard of that. And another person is John Maynard Keynes, the founder of Keynesian economics. He didn't name it that, other people did. So they agreed on how the budget should be run. Actually, Keynes was, I'll tell you what Keynes said exactly. So here's what Milton Friedman said. He said, here's what you should do. He said, what you should do in normal times, you should talk to Tao Zhang and Dan Sullivan and good statisticians and look at the business cycle, get the statistics on the business cycle. So the U.S. economy grows. I'll come back to this. You know, since 1810 or 1815, the U.S. economy has grown roughly per capita income and per capita consumption has grown at about 1.8% a year since then. Almost a constant rate. Very small changes in rates. It's grown at that rate. Didn't matter whether Abraham Lincoln was president. Well, that hurt a little bit, but it wasn't his fault because Jefferson Davis was president of a third of the country. Grew a little slower. But even after that decade, it's just a straight line. And if you want to see a good fit, plot the log of GDP per capita or consumption, 1810. It looks like that. Little wiggles around it. Great Depression of 2008, it's a little tiny wiggle. It just keeps on pumping. You could say, wait a minute, come back to this. Tax rates moved all over the place. Woodrow Wilson during World War I pumped up, and the Democrats pumped up the marginal tax rate to 70 or 80% on wealthy people. And Andrew Mellon and Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge lowered it like back down to 25%. That must have had big supply side effects on the rate of growth. That graph just keeps going like that. That's a fact. We've had big swings in marginal tax rates and the structure of taxes. That thing just keeps going. That's a fact, the data. Okay, so getting back to Milton Friedman and Keynes. So, but you don't always stay in that trend because there's fluctuations. There's been business cycles as long as there's been capitalism. There's times when there's surges in output, booms, and reductions in output, recessions or depressions. So here's what Milton Friedman said. What you should do is balance the budget over the business cycle. So roughly speaking is, on average, you should run a balanced budget. And then you should naturally accept that there's going to be times when you have deficits, and when should those be? You should tolerate bigger government expenditures and taxes today when you're in a boom. I have dyslexia. So I said that exactly wrong, and about half the stuff I'm going to say is going to be wrong in terms of sign. He said when you're in a boom, you should run surpluses, and when you're in recessions, you should run deficits. Government expenditures spend more, but over the cycle, it should balance out, so your debt's not piling up. So you want to basically stabilize your government debt, use it as a buffer, not run it up or run it down over time, just stabilize it over time. And so that's Milton Friedman's rule. So that was their big thing. Keynes actually had written earlier, he refined it. He said, I'm going to be more hard line. I'm going to say the following. And Keynes was also a historian, and he was actually quite conservative. He had read history. He knew history like the back of his hand. So in the 19th century, a whole bunch of countries, they had more sophisticated government books than we do today. This is an accounting thing. The central government kept what's called a current account budget and a capital account budget. So here's what current account budget is. It's spending stuff on today's expenditures that's not going to create any capital. Capital account budget is like for buildings, infrastructure, and stuff that potentially is going to generate revenues on the line, down the road, like a toll bridge. So what Keynes said is you should always balance the current account budget, run capital account deficits when you're in a recession, build infrastructure projects when you're in recessions, and run capital account surpluses when you're in booms. That's his advice. But that's a refined budget balance rule. Got it? And Keynes, who hated inflation, said you should never levy an inflation tax. Milton Friedman said the same thing. They also said the following thing. They said, if you want to have zero inflation and you don't want to levy an inflation tax on poor people, you have to balance the budget in present value sense. So if you want to abstain from the inflation tax, you got to get the taxes from someone else. That's the old-time religion. Okay? So why am I talking about that? Because I was asked, am I just delaying time? Am I just kind of like buying time, like get to the point? I'm trying to tell you how why I can't give you a definite answer to the Trump Republican, and it is 100% Republican tax reform. Didn't get a single Democratic vote, which is something I'll come back to. Okay, so here's the thing: is I don't know what the current tax policy is in the United States. I don't know what it is. I do know that what's in the current law is not what's going to happen. I do know that. How could you say that? Because it's in the law. It's the law of the land. Okay, so and I respect that, but for something to be credible and predictable, it has to be feasible. It has to be possible. And what's in the current law of the United States fiscal policy is not possible. So something that's not, okay, that's just because we don't know everything doesn't mean we don't know anything. Well, what I do know, if it's something impossible, it's not going to happen. Okay. And now, so why do I say that? It's the federal government, our Congress, and our president, because they sign things. They have made promises to us that can't possibly be kept. You want an example of that? What time is it? I want to get done with this quickly because the NFL draft starts very soon, and I have to be elsewhere because I am going to be drafted by the New York Giants on the first round to play quarterback. That's not going to happen. Okay, and that's the same thing with the current tax legislation. Okay, so what's been planned is temporary. So I'll come back to that. So now I'm going to appeal to a little history. Okay, and because we're running big deficits out into the foreseeable future, they're worse than the official numbers say, and they are going to be corrected somehow. And I will even tell you how they're going to be corrected. I will tell you exactly how they're going to be corrected. Either a bunch of tax rates are going to go up sometime, or a bunch of expenditures, military, entitlements, infrastructure, are going to go down sometime. One of those two things is going to happen, or some combination. And that's arithmetic. Okay, so what I don't know is when and which. So the current plan is not sustainable because it's not feasible. Okay, so how could that happen to be? You know, kind of what's going on. So now I'm going to tell you about a little bit economic history, and this is from a personal point of view. Okay. So from the beginning of our republic, go see the play Hamilton. Even if you don't like rap music, I went to see it. Okay. So from the beginning of our republic until 1981, document this, both Democrats and Republicans believed what Milton Friedman and Keynes said, that basically we should run a balanced budget over the cycle, and everyone agreed the government had to run a balanced budget. Now, there were some people who wanted the government to be bigger than others. They were very clear. If I want bigger government expenditures, I mean, I want to tax ourselves bigger, more. That's it. If I want taxes big, it's because I want a big government expenditures, and vice versa. And that was shared by everyone. So I'll give you a quote. General Eisenhower said that. President Eisenhower, great Republican president, who presided over very high tax rates, didn't decrease them. And he gave lectures about federal government's like a family. You can't spend more than you take in if you want to have a stable monetary system. So that's agreed upon. And okay, so something's going on a long time. Something's going on a long time. And some Republicans get the idea. And there's people like Milton Friedman, conservative economist, thought the United States government was too big. They thought it had grown too much. And what they said is they advocated policies where the federal government decreased both taxes and expenditures, kept the balanced budget. Milton Friedman and a bunch of other people wanted a balanced budget amendment. In the late 70s, there's a movement for a balanced budget amendment, never passed Congress, but Milton Friedman was ahead of it. One of my last conversations with Milton Friedman was in early 2000s. Why don't Republicans advocate a balanced budget amendment anymore? And we're going to come back to that. Because you probably never heard that Republicans advocated a balanced budget amendment. We'll come back to that. That means every year the Congress has to do what Keynes and Milton Friedman told them a long time ago. And see how many votes you get for that today. Okay, so something happened between Eisenhower and today. So here's what I think happened, and it's like everyone knows that Friedman and Keynes are right because that's arithmetic, but they started getting using a little game theory. So here's the idea: the Republicans say, look, we're trying to make the government lower, smaller, and what we do is we advocate cutting various things so we can cut taxes. And the people who are receiving entitlements, the businesses who are receiving protection in the form of various taxes, otherwise known as tariffs. A tariff is a tax. I'll come back to that. They don't want to diminish the protections they're receiving, the subsidies, the expenditures, and they're going to resist this. So some advisors of Ronald Reagan got the idea. I'll give you names of Art Laffer's one of them. Got the following: let's do this differently. Let's be a little smarter and use the budget arithmetic to our political advantage. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to reduce taxes. We're going to have tax cuts. They're going to be the Reagan tax cuts. And we're not going to reduce expenditures. We're going to let you keep your entitlements. We're going to let businessmen who are getting subsidies. We're not going to cut food stamps. We're not going to cut aid to education. We're going to reduce tax rates for everybody. And it's going to be a much more democratic in the sense that everybody's going to get lower tax rates. The Reagan tax cut was really big, and basically across the board, across the income distribution. We're going to decrease tax rates for everybody. We're going to leave expenditures high. And you could say, well, what's that going to do to the government deficit? Because you're breaking Eisenhower's rule. And by the way, how long are you going to keep these tax rates low? You're going to say they're permanent. They're never going up. That's the game. They're never going to go up. We're going to reduce taxes now, and guess what's going to happen? There's going to be a government deficit, and the government debt's going to grow, as it did under President Reagan, and he knew that. And Milton Friedman knew it. So what's going to happen? The government deficit's going to grow, and what does that mean is sooner or later, somebody else is either going to have to cut taxes or increase, I said I have dyslexia, increase taxes or cut government expenditures. And they're going to have to take the political heat for cutting government expenditures, but not us, not we, not one of us. Okay, not the Republicans. That's the deal. So that's what they did. So if you look at the government deficit and the percentage of the government budget, like when Reagan takes office, interest payments on the government debt are 5 or 6% of the budget, and when he leaves office, it's 15 or 20. That's a sign of this. Okay, so this is Reaganomics. So what's the goal is Republicans might not always be in. The Democrats might be in. And then put pressure on the Democrats to start governing like Republicans. So they're the ones who are going to decrease government expenditures. And guess what? It more or less worked. Go read Bill Clinton's speech saying the era of big government is over. And we're going to do things to be much more economical. We're going to have welfare reform. So President Clinton presided over government size reduction programs, and he said we're going to balance the budget. And part of the balanced budget is we're going to be economical. So he did things that Lyndon Johnson would never have done. So this is Reaganomics. And so at work. So basically, Reaganomics is playing chicken with the government budget. And it's using deficits as a tool to force your successors to do the dirty work for you. Got it? Okay, so, that's what happened in the 90s. Okay, well, Democrats aren't stupid. So let's fast forward. So just scratch your head and say, okay, we're going to depart from the Milton Friedman, Keynes, Eisenhower thing. We're going to balance the budget. We're not going to pass big debts on to our successors, otherwise known as our children and grandchildren. We're going to pay our bills on time. We're not going to kick the can down the road. And so my reading is Democrats. So the second Bush administration is another story. They lowered taxes and increased expenditures. Okay, so the Democrats get in again, and they have this legacy. Now what are they going to do? Are they going to do, and they inherit a very bad situation. Are they going to be like Clinton? Or are they going to play by Ronald Reagan, the Gippers rule book, for their own end? And just think of the arithmetic's neutral. So I do the following. So let's say I'm a Democrat. I want the government to be bigger. And I want it to be bigger permanently. So what am I going to do? I'm not going to be like President Clinton. I'm going to increase a bunch of expenditures. And I'm going to try to do it permanently. I'm going to move toward, Obamacare. So I'm going to get move part way toward increasing access to medical insurance for people that didn't have it. I'm going to do a bunch of stuff. Is it going to increase government expenditures? Yeah, and it's going to increase it more down the line. I'm going to tie that in, and people are going to like it. It's going to create a constituency for it. Okay, so now but it's going to increase the deficit. Yeah, the deficit's going to go up, and the next time the Republicans get in, they're going to have to increase taxes. That's the deal. So it's, since 1980, with the exception of Clinton, we have two political parties who are playing chicken against the background of this government budget constraint. And that's going on today. Okay, so what's on the books now is not going to stay permanently, because no country can have government. You can have government debt rising over time, but if you eventually get to a point where it can't rise anymore, no one knows exactly what that point is. We know if you may have come from a country where it has been surpassed. Anybody from Greece? I'll give you a bunch of countries where it has been surpassed, and when that happens, there's pressure either to increase taxes on somebody or decrease government expenditures. Okay. So that's where we are today. So Milton Friedman, I'll come back to this. Milton Friedman, who read history, he wrote a great economic history book. He sort of had a rule. This is raw empiricism, not based on a theory. He said, the American government, and indeed most governments, don't address problems until there's a crisis. It's empirical observation that kicking the can down the road is not new. That's what he said. And I want to give you a couple of examples of that in how serious that is. So I'll tell you a historical story, which is going to elaborate on one that the dean told. Okay, and I don't mean to depress you, because some of the things I'm saying are very depressing if you're a citizen, but for a macroeconomist, they're really great because they're turning up some data and some problems for us. So I'm going to tell you a story. Okay. So I'm going to tell you about the French Revolution. Okay, the days of which occurred in 1789, which is the year we also had a revolution, which I'll come back to. The Second American Revolution was in 1789. So here's the deal. In the 1700s and the 1600s, France had a particular kind of government. You could think of it as a game. Actually, this is a good thing to talk about because the French president is here, and go read his address to go listen to his address to Congress. It's worth listening. And actually, he's here because we're an independent country. We would have British accents if the French hadn't helped us. So during the 1700s, France fought 4 wars with Great Britain, and they lost every one except the last one, which is the American War of Independence. So this is the deal. France has a country that's 2 or 3 times as rich and as big as Great Britain. So how is it that they lose? France is taxing its citizen a half or a third per capita as much as Britain is. Britain has a high tax, high spend state. And they've set, because of a revolution they had in 1688, they set things up. They had a democracy where you can think of it as government creditors took over the government, and they had a parliament that was responsible both for borrowing and for levying the taxes to finance the debts. So if you look at the 17th century, Britain is taxing a lot, it's spending a lot, and it's never defaulting. It's the beginning of the gold standard, in Britain being the center. They're creating a reputation for themselves. Okay. Meanwhile, and they have a democracy where the king is restricted more and more. His hands are tied. That's the deal. They have capital markets. Meanwhile, go to France, much bigger, richer country. Go to Versailles. When you graduate from college, make your parents let you go to Versailles. You'll never see anything like it in England or the United States. So it's a wealthy country, but per capita they're taxing about a third what Britain's doing. And furthermore, they're repeatedly defaulting on their debts. They can't borrow very much, and they can't tax very much. And why can't they tax? Because they have a funny constitution. Okay, what they have is, here's the deal. You should think about this now. They have a heavily privatized economy. So what's happened is they have a court system. They have an aristocracy which is exempt from taxation. Why? Because the way France was created was created by the accretion, the king gradually getting more and more people to join France, and they would say, the elites would say, Burgundy, you join France, and the aristocracy there, no taxes, forever. So you can't tax those guys. The church, can't tax the church. Okay, that's part of it. So the first and second estates are people you can't tax in the Constitution. The only guys you can tax are me, because I'm a peasant. I'm not neither. I'm in a third estate. Okay, and I don't have very much money, but that's it. So you can't tax very much. So they can't borrow very much, and when they do borrow, they default. So guess what? When you default, nobody wants to lend you anymore. So that's the situation in France. So what's happening is Britain, this small country, in these first 3 big wars, it beats France. And one way it beats them is it hires mercenaries, hires Germans, and it pays them with gold that's taxed on British citizens. That's kind of the arrangement. Okay, got it? Now here's another reason. So think about this today. The French king says, okay, I've got to get some more revenues. What am I going to do? So how do I collect revenues? Privatized tax system. I don't have, screw the Department of Treasury. I'm just going to privatize the IRS. which they did. They call them tax farmers. And go look up the greatest chemist of the 18th century, Lavoisier, and how he ended his life on the guillotine. Not because he was a chemist and figured out the chemical composition of oxygen. It was because he was a tax collector. That's how he made his money. So the deal was, I set myself up in so here's how you be a tax collector in France. See how this gets popular. Government wants some revenues. Okay? Okay, I privatize. I'll be a tax collector. Sergeant, you don't look like you can be a tax collector. Yeah, but I got some guys behind here who are going to help me. That's how I collect taxes. And what they say is, the king says, give me the taxes up front, give me a bunch of money, and you go and collect the salt tax. Great, I'll collect it. And I'll have my friends collect it. Watch Rocky Balboa. That's how you collect it. So that's the France privatization tax system. So that was going on. Another thing is, you're an aristocrat, and you have a kid, and he's not doing so well at Emory, and you want to get him a job, you buy him a judgeship. So how do you do that? You give the king some money, and then the king takes some money right now, and then he promises he's going to pay the interest on that money, a perpetual loan. The interest on that money is going to go to pay your kid. And that's called the nobility, I think it's called the nobility of the robe or something. So these you can look these all up in the books. So the government has privatized a bunch of things, and it's given away a bunch of future tax revenue. So guess what? Okay, so this is going on. These are French institutions, and the king cannot increase taxes. Furthermore, he can't cut expenditures. He has very limited authority. So the government has a repeated defaults. It has a default in 1775. Okay. Does that year ring a bell? There's a new king in 1775, Louis XVI. He's not going to have a good end, but he appoints the budget is roughly balanced. The budget is roughly balanced because he's just defaulted, and he appoints a great economist. Look him up, named Turgot, as his finance minister. Very smart economist. And what Cournot tells him is, you can keep this budget balanced as long as you don't get into any new wars. You just have it rolling over. 1775. No new wars. You can. So Turgot becomes finance minister, and he gives a speech. If you know the first President Bush, he gives a speech. He says, I promise no defaults and no new taxes. Read my lips. He said that, as long as you don't get in a war. So, 1776, blah, blah, blah. They do get in the war. Thank you. And they incur a bunch of debt. They run the debt up, okay, in France. They don't have new taxes, can't cut expenditures. And now what happens is the interest payments on the debt, they start going higher and higher, and there's a debt crisis, okay, in the 1780s in France. There's a debt crisis. And the king asks, I got to have more power. I have to have more power. Because the way things are working out now in this game, I can't cut expenditures. It's a great book by Simon Schama. You can read. I can't cut expenditures. I can't increase taxes. I can't borrow because I can't. And my debt keeps piling up. And the interest rates, you know, I offer loans. Nobody takes them up. Okay, so now the king says, I want to call the Estates General together, which is the French Constitution, so I can revise the French Constitution. And only Estates General can do that. It has not met since 1613. Okay. Now, there was an earlier time when France also had a debt crisis in 1720 or so. Okay. And the person who was the regent of France, effectively the king, he asked his finance minister, I have this fiscal crisis now, I'm going to call the Estates General together so I can increase my power to tax so I can service the debt. He called them together. And we have this memo. His finance minister, his prime minister wrote him a memo. If you call the Estates General together to try to reform the Constitution, you will have a revolution on your hands. And the king at that time said, I think I won't call the States General together. I think I'm going to default on most of my debt. And that's what he did. Okay, so now we're going to fast forward to 1788. Same conversation occurs. And this time, the king calls the Estates General together. And the purpose of calling the Estates General together is to reform the French Constitution so he has the ability to tax to solve a fiscal crisis. Now here's a question. This is the gold standard. If you could solve this problem for history, why did he call it together in 1788 when he didn't call it together in 1720? And in 1720, he was going to be told the consequences. Why? And crack that one, and you'll be a great historian and a great economist. I have my back pocket theory, but it's just completely made up, you know. So my theory, guess what? My theory is, well, the creditors of the government were more powerful in 1780s than they were and they didn't want to be defaulted on. So that's what they did. And then you start reading what they did is gradually all hell broke loose after this new revolution. The whole beginning of the French Revolution is to rearrange fiscal affairs. And they did stuff, they did very creative stuff for monetary economists. The first thing they did is they nationalized all church lands, and then they privatized them. So what they did is the church had about 20% of the lands, and these guys in the French Revolution, the guys who are pulling this off, they're anti-clerical. And there's very colorful stories. The person that proposes this is a man named Talleyrand. Read about him. He's the subject of Henry Kissinger's PhD thesis in history, Talleyrand. He's a bishop who's an atheist, but he's at the Estates General, and he rises in the Estates General in the fiscal crisis, and what he says, he gives a speech, and he says, Bishop Talleyrand, but then Bishop Talleyrand rises, he says, the church in France has more than enough land to service the needs of God. Let's nationalize it and then sell it off and privatize it to private guys. And what is that land? It's income-producing property. And then what we're going to do with the benefits is we're going to pay the creditors. And it turns out, to read Talleyrand's speech, the value of that church land is just about equal to the value of the government debt that's owned. So Talleyrand has this, it's a vast privatization scheme. But before we privatize, we're going to get something to privatize. We're going to grab it from the church. And then other things happened. So I talk about this because it's the way the French fiscal crisis was solved was a political revolution. It took a long time to work out, and it eventually led to Napoleon Bonaparte, who had a really good way to balance the budget. And here's the way he's going to balance the budget. He's going to do globalization. So he's going to say, I'm going to run a balanced budget. I'm going to spend a lot of money. And I'm going to get the Spanish and the French and the Italians. And I'm going to try to get the Russians to pay. That was a scheme, and it worked for about 15 years. But, okay, so the reason I mention this is just one example. The dean mentioned another example. The Second American Revolution, and what I mean by that is, you know, you could write another play about Hamilton. He tells you a lot of good stuff, but doesn't tell you the dark side. Hamilton and Madison were committing treason because we had a constitution. It's called the Articles of Confederation. It was very different, and it was a constitution that was designed to keep the central government small. It was a states' right convention, a state rights constitution. The power to tax and the power to print money was in the 13 sovereign states. The central government had no ability to tax or spend or borrow. and for people who wanted a small central government, it was working like a charm. And for people like Madison and Hamilton and creditors of the federal government debt that was going at 10 cents on the dollar, it was a banana republic. So what they did is they committed treason to the Articles of Confederation, which was the United States. They met behind closed doors. They swore they would tell nobody what they had done, what they were doing. You can read about what they did in Madison's notes. And they rearranged sovereignty. They took the power to tax and spend and borrow from the states, and they moved it to the federal government. And then they were brilliant political scientists. They rearranged the loyalties of constituencies. They transferred the loyalties of the creditors of the state governments to become creditors of the federal government for the explicit purpose of making them want to support high federal taxes. And Alexander Hamilton says that's what he's doing. 33-year-old kid, he's Secretary of Treasury, and he wrote something called the Report on Public Credit. And if you have an hour, read that. So that's what they did. So that's another fiscal revolution, and I can tell you more and more. The spirit is if fiscal crises often produce political revolutions of one kind or another, and that's why macroeconomics and financial economics is serious. So the two big opponents of that's why it's serious. It's interesting to study in history, and it's vital for citizens to understand. And I don't think you want to live in a country where you have fiscal crises. Okay. So then a final thing. So pull the plug on me. Okay. So I'm going to recommend a book to read. It's by Douglas Irwin. It's called Clashing Over Trade. And now's the time to read it. It's an economic history book about the history of U.S. trade policy. And so here's what the book's about. What you have to remember is taxes aren't just in your federal tax rate. Federal government poses various kinds of taxes on you, both directly and indirectly, via tariffs and via import restraints. And they're taxes that take money out of your pocket and give it to some businessmen. That's what they're doing. So here's the deal. After Hamilton and Madison got through, the power to levy tariffs in the United States Constitution is exclusive in the United States Congress. That's what the Constitution says. Okay. So my wife Carolyn said, smart person, she said, wait a minute. President Trump says he's threatening to raise tariffs. He is raising tariffs. He can't do that because the U.S. Constitution says Congress can do it. And Congress, well, she's right. Until 1930 or 35, the Congress levied every tariff on every commodity. And they had increasing arguments about it, and businesses lobbied Congress for tariff increases. Now, it was never all businesses. It tended to be inefficient businesses who wanted to screw other businesses in the United States and other workers. So it's like iron manufacturers and steel manufacturers who want to increase the price of domestic steel for American consumers and American producers who use steel. So this is helping some producers and workers, and it's hurting others. It's a tax transfer scheme. So that's old as a hill. Congress used to administer that. What happens in the 1930s, it's really interesting. And it happens under both parties. Gradually, the Congress delegates more and more authority to regulate trade and tariffs, not only to the president, but various executive agencies, the Commerce Department, and various special agencies. So over time, agencies are created, and Congress says, you do it. And if look up Fast Track Authority on Wikipedia. There's an interesting history. Okay, so the president now does have that authority in the executive branch. Now, if you're a political scientist or a sociologist, you should ask yourself, and this book is, Irwin's book is full of this, why did Congress do this? And one of the reasons is it got sick and tired spending all of its time fending off these lobbyists, trying to get them to vote particular tariffs. Let the Commerce Department do it. And another reason was you could they had a hunch that you could represent interests of people who were being harmed by tariffs better by having the federal government, having the executive do it. And read this section of what President Reagan did in terms of tariff policy and trade policy. So if you read that, you'll see what's going on today. It's absolutely nothing new. Just the names of the commodities changed. That's it. So what do I mean by that? The United States has been threatening retaliation against other countries, trying to get them to lower their other countries impose trade barriers on us, old as the hills, and we try to get them to reduce it. One way that we could try to get it to reduce it is we threaten retaliation. Now the question is, how do we negotiate with them? Well, a consensus emerged between both Republicans and Democratic experts on this, that it's better to do it multilaterally than bilaterally. Why? Well, we had some nasty experiences with bilateral trade deals. Read Irwin's book. One thing is, you know about OPEC? It's a cartel that raises. That didn't just happen. The United States government policy is a big part of the responsibility for OPEC. Because what did we do? We formed a couple bilateral trade deals that made sweetheart deals with two countries and excluded all the OPEC countries. There was no OPEC. So within a year or so, OPEC said, we're not going to take this. We're going to create a cartel, and we're going to screw the United States next time we want to. And they did, twice. So that's the birth of OPEC. So this is a thing where if you think you do a trade thing and they're not going to retaliate in creative ways, they have smart people, they have lawyers, and they're going to retaliate. You got to think that through. And President Reagan is really aware of that. So President Reagan, who voted for Franklin Roosevelt 4 times, agreed with Roosevelt on a lot of things. One thing Roosevelt wanted to do is he wanted to open up trade because he thought the United States could outcompete other countries. Reagan thought the same thing. So that's what's going on there. So then, so there's kind of nothing new with trade. Some of the names are different. And then a final thing, intellectual property violations. So I want to close on 2 things. They're as American as apple pie. If you go back to the 19th century and you look at the history of technology and intellectual property violation, who's a big violator of international property law? It's my country, the United States. 2 ways. We stole factory designs and imported technology from Britain. We didn't pay for it. Novels. We didn't copyright novels. You can buy lots of cheap British novels in the United States. We don't pay royalties. And the British complained about that throughout the 19th century. And we said, that's your problem. And when did we start wanting to protect international property? Well, guess what? When we had some. So, okay, that's one final thing. Then the other thing is, this is 5th grade economics or Econ 101. So I'll tell you 2 things. Okay, so the Chinese are taking advantage of us. They're taking advantage of this poor Apple Corporation. These naive Apple Corporation, because they forced those nasty Chinese lawyers, they forced the naive Apple lawyers to sign contracts will say, well, we can get into China and do some business, but you have to transfer some technology to us in the form, you have to share some technology with us. And those stupid Apple lawyers, you know, they don't care about their stockholders. They signed this contract, and they need the U.S. government to protect them. So scratch your head about that. And then you kind of ask, what's going on when you say the United States government should get in the business of that? So there's some serious things to ask about that. And I'm not prejudicing. So no question that other countries are going to play hardball. And but we got guys who can play hardball too. So is the government going to help that or hurt it? How's it going to do it? And is it going to help it by screwing a bunch of farmers that live near where I am because of the retaliations? Okay, so on. That's one thing. And then the final thing. So this is brought to you by the 4th grade class in Heinsberg, Vermont. It's a direct question. Okay, so we saw in the news that the Chinese are really hurting us, and the way they're hurting us is they're producing a bunch of goods, and they're doing it either with state subsidies or something, and then their government is paying U.S. businessmen to import those goods to the United States and sell them at half of what they really cost. So we're getting them at half cost, and the Chinese are paying for that. So they're dumping on us. And wait, are they dumping on us or are they giving us a gift? So Grandpa, it looks to me like they're giving us a gift. And shouldn't they be doing more of it? So I say, like, so what do I say to him? I say, well, this is, economics is too hard for some little 4th grader to understand, so don't ask questions like that.